Want to build Raffi's trailer from Star Trek Picard? So do I. Let's get to it. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Swords and Sandals. This time we're going to build Raffi's trailer from Star Trek Picard. I have been so excited to do this ever since the show came out. First off, I am the biggest fan of The Next Generation. I have loved it forever. Picard has always been my favorite captain. And, the moment Picard went to Raffi's trailer, I knew instantly I have to build that. All right, so, like every project that I do, I always print out my templates. And on here I'm using, I think it's, this is the outer layer, so this is going to be the 2-inch, the 2-ply chipboard. Eventually I'm going to cut this off and I'm going to put these individual pieces on the 1-ply chipboard. But I say be very careful with this 2-ply stuff. It's just, multiple passes with the razor blade is a much safer bet. Otherwise, that razor blade will just jump track and potentially go into a finger or something like that. So, but see, there it is right there. It skipped on me. Here are all of the pieces, all of the attachments that are going to be on the 1-ply. Well, you can just make sure to keep that stuff kind of separate because I didn't at first, and it became kind of a pain assembling it. Okay, so in here I am actually sanding the edges down before I finally glue the stuff down for good. The reason is that in the model it curves, and it's the easiest way to do that beforehand. So here's that 1-ply that I cut out, and then I'm going to eventually, sort of glue one piece at a time on the 2-ply there. Now, once this is done, I make sure it's really it's seated very, very carefully, and then I put a weight on top of it to make sure it doesn't peel back up. Because the one thing with this chipboard is sometimes it will curve up on you, so you have to make sure to watch out for that. And that's why I try to go through. I go through with my finger and make sure that I have a pretty even coat of glue across the whole thing. Otherwise, there's always that possibility of it peeling up or curling on you, and you definitely don't want that. See, here it is. I glue a couple pieces on, and then I put a flat piece of chipboard down, so that way it'll help distribute the weight evenly, or a bit more evenly than if it was just sitting on top of it by itself. And I keep the top piece or the whatever adjoining piece there, so that way I can keep it as a guide to make sure I actually line these things up correctly, because once you do it, there's pretty much no going back. So there's all the pieces, all of them are connected here, and I'm getting ready to put that down. Now, I'm going to prime the whole thing eventually with this paint. Ultimately, don't do that. It's a waste of time. Inevitably, it was a big waste for me. So just skip that and just paint the stuff by hand, or paint it all by spray can with, whatever suits your fancy. So here I am going back through and trying to make sure that all of the gaps in between are actually clear of debris, and maybe I sand them down a little bit just to space them out a bit more. So there we are. This is not glued down, it's just masking tape down. I do this a couple different times to make sure that everything is going to be lined up before I commit to anything that I can't go back on. So in this case, I'm actually noticing there are some bigger gaps than I cared about. This window over here, I did not like the way it was designed, but at this point, that was something that I'd have to go back to the drawing board on, and I wasn't going to commit to that. I will actually go back and change it in the blueprint, though, the templates and such. So right here, I'm just using a Sharpie, and I'm just going to measure or mark where the gold paper is going to go for the windows when I glue them down. This gold paper is just a regular sort of, I think it's called bright yellow gold. It's from the scrapbooking paper aisle. So it's pretty thick, actually. Much thicker than what I was planning on at first, but you got to watch these ridges. As thick as this stuff was when I finally glued it down, I ended up seeing the seams in the foam, and that was not good. So if you want to do that, you need to actually put some spackling down or whatever and make that edge smooth. Cut it out with a foam cutter or something, because it will show up, and I didn't realize that until it was too late. So just make sure the glue's even and go from there. So I glued everything that was individual windows to the pieces because there wasn't a point on and gluing it to the foam board, the foam block anyway. And a couple of those empty windows are going to go pieces of chipboard as well. So that's why they don't have windows in them. And then, as I say, everything that was a window that's going to curve onto another surface, that's what I put on the foam block. So here I am finally gluing all of that stuff down. This was a real problem because once those things get really small there with the chipboard, I had a problem with the chipboard splitting on me, I don't know what I did or what I could do differently, but whatever the case is, you have to really keep an eye on that and be very, very careful when you're on those edges, because I probably spent a couple of hours just repairing the edges, and that was before I even started spackling the whole thing and fixing the edges. So you do really, really, really run a risk of that kind of stuff happening. So anyway, as I say, I'm going to put all this stuff together eventually here, and I have to do one piece at a time. I'm afraid of any piece slipping on me. You got to watch out for that slipping. So here I am patching. This is just regular drywall patch. I've used a couple different ones to practice and just see which ones work best. Inevitably, I went with the drywall patch because it's easy to sand. If you do something that's a much stiffer one, like the molding paste, it's going to be really hard to sand that stuff down, and inevitably you're going to get a real problem. So I did find that I was trying to, if you look on the right side, I did use some molding paste just to fill in the gap because it dries so hard, and then I put spackling on top of it to kind of use that, to make it round. But you don't have to do that. You can just use spackling and then not worry about it at all. It's going to dry good enough, and the glue is going to hold it down to the foam, so you should be safe no matter what. Be liberal with it, and then just fix it later in the sanding. So here is after 2 passes. I sand it, I put some more spackling back on it, I sanded it again, and you're going to notice that it's not 100% perfect. I keep trying through the whole mold, but I could just never get it 100% perfect for my liking. So this is where I'm assuming it's going to be where the replicator computer board matter compartment is, whatever it is. I figure it's like sort of where all the matter is stored, because that's why it sticks out from the thing a little bit more. But this is just a small piece of chipboard attached to one of those Dollar Tree foam board things with the paper ripped off, so it's pretty thin. Don't use a weight when you're doing this stuff, because this tacky glue with that kind of foam will just slip right off. It's a real problem. So just basically attach them like a little sandwich and then let them just sit as they are. Otherwise, you're going to have a real problem with it. I went through maybe 2 or 3 because no matter what I did with the weight, they would always slide off. Even when I had braces on each side to make sure it didn't do that, it still didn't. So once that finally dried, I'm using modeling paste right here for this. This is Liquitex modeling paste. So I'm using this because the piece itself is actually kind of fragile, and sometimes with just regular drywall spackling, it will sink in on you a little bit. Now I use the no shrinking and just the basic stuff that you can get for a couple bucks at Walmart, but in this case I needed to make sure it was thick and it would hold its edge. And also the nice thing about this modeling paste, it dries in about 5 minutes, and this was going to be so thick I did not want to wait all night for it to finally set up and dry so I can sand it. So eventually I get all this, I make this little edge on the whole thing, sort of a little bit of an angle, like a taper on all the edges, And then this is when I have to get some sandpaper. So I don't know if you can see it from here. It probably, yeah, you probably can't see it, but I sanded too much of it away with this 60 grit foam or sandpaper, and I had to go back over it a couple times because I guess I was sanding too hard. So there it is. Once it's all sanded down and everything like that, so inevitably, uh, just do my normal thing, glue it down, put a weight on it, and then prime the whole thing over, including the other pieces of raw chipboard. So I'm about to make the bottom frame. So in this case, all I'm doing is I'm buying, this is the Elmer's foam board, and I leave both sides of the paper on because it's nice and rigid, and you can glue stuff to this foam board and it won't peel off or worry about that. So I just cut it to size and literally just glue it down. The great part about it is that my chipboard is a little, it doesn't go all the way down to the very, very bottom. There's a little bit of a gap by accident, but it was a happy accident because once I put it on, it already created that little seam that I have going through the rest of the stuff. If you don't have that, you gotta create maybe a couple layers of paper underneath of it, some cardstock or something, just to create a gap. But if you already have that gap, then you're lucky. So I glue the feet down and glue everything down. I say this is the same. It's like 1.5 by 1.5 inches on these. I don't know what you'd call them. Just support sections. I don't know. Let's just call them feet. So I noticed in the couple shots that were in the show that they kind of rounded off a little bit. So the it didn't work. I ended up using my finger to just smudge a bunch of stuff on there so I could get a little bit of a rounded edge, and then just came back in and sanded it down just a little bit. And again, this is joint compound, so it sands really easy. I'm just leveling it all out and getting it sanded down. I don't really care about it too much because it's the bottom. I just care about what it looks like on the side. So you're going to see that gap that I was talking about just earlier. But the problem is that because the paper is on there, and once you cut that foam is going to like recede just a little bit. So the problem is that when it was all said and dried, I had this very obvious seam going across it. So then I used no, what is this? This is the molding paste again. I'm using it to actually kind of smooth that out. This stuff is much thicker, so it was actually, it had a little bit easier time kind of hiding the line, whereas drywall patch might sink in a little too much. But inevitably I ended up having to do this, I think twice, because I had to sand it down. I just really thin layer, and then I had to sand it down and then redo it. Okay, so I went through a couple different ideas on how to create the deck, and inevitably I landed on this. This is a 1/2 inch piece of foam, and inevitably once I get it all cut out, I'm gonna have to carve into it a little bit and create the shape in the deck. But this was the easiest way. I was sort of in a time crunch too, and did not have a lot of time to wait to glue smaller pieces of foam together, and so I just went with this one. It worked out really, really well, but the problem is you mess up just a little bit, you have to go back and redo the whole thing over again, because once you start carving into something, if you mess up a little bit, it's kind of hard to save it. So I just sort of plumb a line around the edges there from the bottom and on the sides, and that's going to be my sort of, I just sort of ballparked it on sort of a gap that was going to show in for this bottom support piece or whatever for the thing. So when I do go to cut it, and actually let me stop for a second. And this, it's pretty easy to do, just sort of using the pencil to plumb a line. But if you're not used to it, practice on a couple different pieces of foam before you get into that. If not, just go back and start measuring the edges. It takes a little bit longer, but it's a safer bet. So here I am cutting this with a brand new razor, and I'm just cutting into it just a little bit. Remember, you only want to cut into it enough. Otherwise, if you cut too deep, you're going to end up cutting a piece off of it. This is where I say that you don't have, it's not very forgiving. So you just have to go very slowly, a little bit at a time, a little bit at a time. Especially right there on that left side there where it's just so thin. I have a chance of just cutting completely through that. So be careful, as I said. And I say this is almost real time here. I've just sped it up just a little bit. So I think this is pretty much, yeah, as I say, it's just a little faster than real time. So you can tell how slow I'm going to be going here to cut a little piece at a time until I'm finally able to free it up. Happily, I have a little bit of practice doing this kind of stuff, so I only made one piece of this. I did not have to go back and redo the whole thing, thankfully. You're going to find that, well, at least with me, I have a hard time cutting foam, so you're going to have to fix the edges sometimes too, just depending on how well it's going to be visible to the sides. So this is one ply chipboard, and this is the cutout for the rail. This was a pain in the butt. It is a one ply, so be very, very careful, because even if you do cut the straight edge, what's going to end up happening is just by moving it around and holding onto it with your fingers, you might actually bend or stretch out the piece a little bit. So you have to be careful about that. I had to constantly keep sort of reshaping this as I went along and double checking the edges and making sure, because I didn't want to get too far into it and then realize that something had happened and then it won't match on the model. So, take your time, especially with me, my big hands and working with these little bitty objects. I really have to make sure and take my time with this stuff and be very gradual, because I have a heavy hand and sometimes I will cut pieces in two without really paying a whole hell of a lot of attention to it. So just be careful in that regard. And you have to make two of each piece. So there's the two long pieces, and then there are going to be two small ones. There they are right there. There's the two regular size and the two small ones on the other side there. Obviously, always double checking and making sure. This is apple barrel paint. I think it's called pavement. I did not want to make it black. I think it's black, like a black matte that's down in the show, but I was afraid that black would be, I don't know, too heavy-handed for the rest of the colors, and it would, I don't know, it just wouldn't look right to me, I don't think. So I actually really like this color. It came, it's really dark. It covers all the text on the foam really easily, but I still ended up going back and letting it dry and doing two coats to be on the safe side. But it dries nice. It also dries super flat, which is what I wanted. So, as I say, I think you can kind of tell the color in here. Now, I don't know, this tub off to the right-hand side here, I decided that the body of the trailer was just too dark, so I needed to go back and lighten it up a little bit. Okay, so here is the most delicate thing I think I have done in my modeling so far. I had no idea if this was going to work or not. This was the only way I could come up with anything. I mean, look at this. It's like one piece is pretty much the size of my fingernail. So these little supports that are balsa wood, and they are probably just shy of 1/16 square, and about, I don't know, about maybe 3/4 of an inch tall, maybe an inch tall. So I eyeballed this completely. I did not measure any kind of concept there. I just eyeballed this to whatever looked good for the scale that I had the deck. So I started with the ends and one piece at a time just to make sure, and I realized, and you can see it leaning there. So because it's just this one ply chipboard, it was all over the place. So every time, literally every single time I made one change, I had to keep going back and making sure that it was level. And see, even here, I put this weight down on it to sort of keep it from popping up on me, and it keeps wanting to twist. It twisted all of the time. Inevitably, I went against my gut feeling, and I put a lot more together on it than just sort of doing the one at a time. I did the ones on the ends thinking that it would help with the support. It didn't. I don't know if there's a good way of doing this. I feel the way I did it, honestly, was probably the most backwards way you could ever imagine doing it. I don't know. Maybe it's the only way. But it was tedious. But I will admit, this only took me about 20 minutes. It took a lot longer, obviously, for it to dry and make sure it was dry. And then I went back with some super glue and made sure it was sort of bonded really, really well. I did not use super glue when I glued this down. I used tacky glue because, as you can see, I would constantly hit something, and I wanted to make sure that once that super glue would just dry too quick, and then I would be stuck. So, and then I'd have to cut it out and probably ruin the piece. So I went with tacky glue and opted for safety and just waiting for the glue to dry a lot quicker. So let's see here. I'm a little off on my measurements a little bit here, but I think it's going to be okay. It looked fine at the end of the day. And as I said, this pencil was a great thing it was just light enough that it didn't cause any damage, and it was, just enough to weight it down a little bit. So I made one piece of the railing, the smaller piece, and I just sort of tried to straighten out the wires manually, just sort of rolling them on the pad a little bit. They're horrible. So when you see some close-ups, you're going to see the fact that they're kind of all bent and everything everywhere. So I finally just decided to just this is the only thing I had available, and I just went ahead and you just take a power drill, get it on the end, hold it down. Now on this one, I actually wrapped it around the plier, thinking that it was going to cause some real resistance. It did not. You can just hold it. You're going to see what happens when, yes, there it is, when it's tied too tightly around the thing. You're going to end up bending it in the process. So, but it worked. The only downside here is you can see the twists in the wire. I think that might really work out really well for like barbed wire, if you're going to make little barbed wire. But when you're making just a regular cord, it doesn't look like braided wire. It just looks like, well, it looks like barbed wire, honestly. Just without the barbs coming out the edges. But you can see how straight this process does work. And at the end of the day, it's fine, especially if you paint over the wire. So there's everything finally dried. It's holding up on its own. I'm very happy about that. So what I am going to do is I'm going to put this nice heavy bead of tacky glue down the rails. And then I am going to slowly but surely seat these wires. They're all cut out to specifically, once I got everything there, I cut it out. You can actually cut these with a pair of scissors. Now, I used a wire coil that I straightened out. But I realized you could just use floral wire. It comes in long strands. It's green, so you might have to paint it if you don't want it to be green. But they're already straight and they're long, and they're the exact same diameter that I got for this like 20 gauge copper wire. But I kept it copper because I thought it kind of looked good for along with the gold windows. But and it also prevented me from having to paint it. So I'm just laying them on there. I'm cheating because if you look at it in the show, the wires actually go through the railing, to hold it and support it all together. This balsa was just way too brittle and way too small. I guess if you really wanted to make the wire go through, you'd probably have to do some sort of like a plastic, something along those lines, from Plastistruct or something where you could drill a really tiny hole and wire, and thread this wire through it. Again, I couldn't do it. I didn't have any of the tools for that. And as I say, at this point, I think I'm on day 26, 27, so I was really in a rush to get this done. especially as I wasn't even sure at this point if what I was doing here was going to work. So once it's all down there, I just put another thick glob of glue on top of them, figuring that hopefully that'll keep the whole thing secure. And again, I'm not using super glue. I'm using tacky glue because, again, I'm just not sure if this is going to work or not. So I want to have the opportunity to be able to pull them off if it's not looking like it's going to work. But it did. They glued, pretty dry for the most part, and then I ended up painting over just those little parts there of the railing. And you can, except for the, obviously the bump of it over the rail, you really can't tell that I put them, just on the back, which was really handy. It worked out really well. So these are the corner pieces. Now, I cut these out of balsa because I was just concerned about being able to cut them out of 2-ply chipboard without cutting my finger off, because it's small and pieces like this small are hard to cut out 2-ply chipboard without the chipboard peeling apart or something else. So I made this out of balsa, and I cut about 20 of these little pieces out and broke half of them in the cut. Eventually, I was able to finally get 8 of these things, and boy, was I so careful with these things because they were so brittle, so brittle. I have no idea how to do that any better than what I did, but it was frustrating. Now, you'll have to forgive me. I don't have the footage for this, the Stair. I did use Plastistruct plastic that I had laying around. I had bought a bunch of this stuff and had no idea what to do with it. Eventually, it came in handy. I did make part of the railing out of it. And as I did that, that's why I can say you could probably use that for the rest of it, because I should have used it instead of chipboard, or of balsa. But oh well, hindsight 2020 and all. So, but I didn't film it, and I don't have it, for this video, simply because I didn't know what I was doing. I was making it up as I went along, and it took me a long time. It took me 2 or 3 days to really get the stairs where I liked them, and I still don't really like them. I had to kind of go against my original measurements, just simply because it wasn't working. I'm not a big fan of super glue. In this case, tacky glue does not stick to the plastic quickly enough for the other materials for my liking. So, you have to use super glue to get this stuff to really stick. And then you have to be patient because it doesn't stick right away. But it's, about 10 seconds later, it'll take care of it. Yet again, in my due diligence of making sure that I'm always triple checking my work before I get to the point where I can't go backwards. There's no undo on these things. You just have to, once you create a step and that step is a mistake, you just have to figure out a way to sort of hide that mistake and make it work for your model. So in this case, I glued this piece of foam on the bottom of it toward the back, so this way you wouldn't see it from the side of the model, so much anyway. And I did this because I did not want to glue the deck to the trailer. I figured, first off, it would never be glued, it would never be attached to the thing anyway. It would just be supported and weighted down anyway, because it'd be heavy. And because the stuff wouldn't come formed together. It would just be assembled on site, if it were real. So I just decided, I'm like, okay, I needed something to help support this thing, and those little wooden supports things were a pain in the butt. I just used skewer sticks and some cheap foam that I could poke through, and then eventually glued these things together, and the scale worked out pretty well. So here is me working on those actual tree branch columns to hold up the canopy. The column here is probably thicker than the scale from the show, but I needed to feel comfortable with being able to have something that could support weight for that canopy. However, at this point, I have no idea how I was going to make the canopy and the support rails for it or whatever. So all I knew is that it needed to be big enough that it could support whatever I had going on. It's balsa, and I just whittled it down until it was round for the most part. And I left the bottom, if you can see it there, I left the bottom of it square, so that way it would slide and fit into the foam a lot easier, because it's very hard for me to cut out a circle in foam, but I can definitely cut out a square. So, and that's the reason that I still kept it there, and they sink in a little bit. It's a good measurement for how far they have to go into for me. So I made these, trimmed down to match the size that they needed to be. I always cut stuff too long. This way I can always go back later and find that, because I cut stuff too short sometimes, and then I regret it because I have to go back and redo the whole thing. So this is just, I was having, for whatever reason, I think it was rain had come in, and just the atmosphere, the pressure, there was just too much moisture in the air. The glue was not drying. It was causing a lot of problems, and it ended up making me damage some of those supports because they're just so freaking brittle. See, I was having a lot of trouble with this. I don't know why it would not, well, let's say, it was just really damp. It had been raining. A lot of storms had come through, so, and I don't have a dehumidifier, so I just had to kind of deal with it. It took all night for that little block to dry, believe it or not. But you can see that I'm actually pretty happy with the way it turned out. Even the little support columns on the side, they worked out. They worked out pretty well. So I had to keep it upside down so I don't put any undue pressure on that, and it slides or it pops off or it breaks or something, because it happened. Now there's this one pylon here that it's not a standard. It's definitely different than the rest of them because it has a base, like a little foot on it. The reason is that I cut the thing too short, and so I had to add a piece of foam to make it work. Now I made all of the supports much taller than they needed to be. If you'll notice, the stairs don't actually touch the ground. The reason is that the intention was to put this in its own little landscape. I don't do it here, but I want to put it in a landscape so I can sink the supports into the and then put like some landscaping around it. So this way, it wouldn't just be right here on the surface. It would go in and be secure. So, okay, so I finally have the supports in there. Cut them out on the edges. This is also one of the reasons why you don't glue this to the trailer. But okay, so there's some little green wire over there. I started using that stuff once I found that I actually had some floral wire in a box. So I took that out, I folded it up onto itself, and then curled the wire around it, sort of like create a little braid, and then I used those as the supports across to each beam. So the reason that I did that is because honestly, I nothing else seemed like it was going to work. Everything seemed too heavy. I thought about the idea of just using pieces of wood to put them across, because I still had, a lot of this balsa wood left. But the more I looked at the images from the show, my posts were already much thicker than they should be. And I was really concerned that if I had gone through and tried to put a post that was too thick, whatever I ended up using for the canopy, which at this point, I still don't know what I'm doing for the canopy. I'm really winging it to just try to figure out to make it look like it's supposed to. So, and this was a little rough here. Having to cut it out, I measured it and then cut it out. I cut it out smaller. I wanted to make sure that I could throw some glue in there, but I wanted to make sure that the foam itself was going to actually hold the thing in place. It wasn't going to pull out because of that. That cheap foam, you can drill into it. You know, you can just poke a hole and it'll separate on you. But with this MDF stuff, or the XDF, sorry, this is XDF foam, extruded foam. When you poke a skewer into it, it just pushes it down and then screws everything up. So it was a real problem. So that, you know, you had to cut it and you had to make sure. So I figured might as well go ahead, and if I cut it a little smaller, making those ends square, it was really, really snug. And I still glued it, but honestly, I didn't have to, because it was in there. It was not going to come out, at least without force. So be careful about this. Make sure your hands are not underneath the blade. I'm saying this from experience. just be careful. Be aware of the blade at all times. Don't be me. But so yeah, it's took a little bit of time just to make sure it was there. I measured this thing 2 or 3 different times before I committed to putting it down. So here it is. I could not get these things to figure out how I was going to attach them. I was going to just wrap them, but that was going to take too long and it was too delicate. So I just sat them on there, and then I just grabbed globs of super glue and just very, very carefully brushed on these big globs of the stuff. And it actually worked. It bonded really, really well to the wood, and then inevitably sealed up the little loops that I had created on the ends. Just from folding. Nothing. I didn't do anything really special. While I was there, I went ahead and just threw some super glue down there on the bottom, making sure that the wood didn't come up, or if I bumped it or something like that, it didn't actually make something unlevel. So this is just some generic, it's like apple barrel brown paint. I just picked one off the shelf, and I only did one coat because the stuff is kind of translucent. So after I went through with just the one coat, it actually, you can see the wood grain really, really well. So I thought that was good enough. The stuff in the show has bark on it, so I just it just is what it is. This is some nylon cotton ribbon or something like that I just had from some other project. So it was sort of porous. It was flat. There wasn't any kind of glossy kind of coating on it or whatever. So I just decided to use this. I just so happened I had tan. But any color will work, because you can just go back and paint it. So I am cutting these things out, and I am creating like little rounded edges on the sides, because I noticed, it wasn't flat and square. So this is undiluted tacky glue. Sorry, it's a little blown out. I can't really help that without making the whole thing dark. I just put it on a piece of white foam to make sure I had something to glue it to, or to have it stick. But I'm just brushing on this glue and making sure that it's as saturated that I could possibly get it, and making sure it's kind of even, because if you push your finger on there, you'll actually pull all the glue away from the stuff. So you got to be careful about that. So once I get it nice, thick, and even across the thing, I can pull these 3 pieces right up, and then toss it right on the wire supports, and then you can start shaping it a little bit. If you've ever done this before, you're not going to be able to shape it the way you want right away. So you're just going to have to go back in stages as it's drying and kind of shape it from there. And inevitably, I'm going to end up putting on another coat of the glue once it dries. The second coat is actually a more thinned out version. I think like a 3-to-1. So this way it was a little easier to put it on. But it's nice and stiff. It's not super hard. You can still, as you can see there, you can still move it around a little bit. But I need to paint it because the original in the show is not beige. It's this sort of almost like quilt of different colors that was used to put it all together. So I'm just picking 2 random colors that are in the brown spectrum. One is actually a much more bluish brown, and the other one is obviously a much redder brown. But I just sort of dabble this stuff on a little at a time until I get until I get it where it looks pretty decent, like right here. So this is, I go back and with a couple different colors just to kind of play around with the coloring, trying to keep the original color showing too, because I thought that was pretty good. But ultimately this is really just for weathering and making sure that it was a little closer to the show. See, it's a little closer. It's still not exactly the same, but it's close enough. It works. And there it is. So I had to actually take some personal liberties and redesign some stuff, but I made this back window that sort of wraps around. I just felt like it was very important to have that next generation look to it, and that's what the next generation does. It just sort of has these panels that wrapped around and curved around things for really no reason, and I had to put it in there. This was sort of near and dear because I've always been this huge fan of Star Trek, and to be able to finally do something like this in the Star Trek world, because my skill level's not there yet to being able to build, the Enterprise or something like that with all the curves and what little bit of tools that I do have and sort of the 3 or 4 materials that I use right now. I just have never been able to even, fathom doing something like that just yet. But when I saw that trailer, I just said, okay, this is it. This is in my wheelhouse. Being able to, to do something in the Star Trek universe has just been a dream come true. And I think I'm going to do more later on down the road. But my ambition exceeds my skill right now. So hopefully that will, sort of meet in the middle at one point or another. I learned some things along the way. First off, I never realized how big my hands were until they're taking up the whole freaking camera. And so I'm still learning how to make this where I can see what's going on and cut this so I don't cut my fingers off, and then be able to get the camera around there so you can actually see something that's going on. And I realized that along the way, my fingers are blocking all this really, really, really small detail. And I'm going to try to figure out a better way of doing that so you can actually kind of see what's going on. But okay, so that is it for this time. I really hope you liked it. I know I really enjoyed making this. So please, like, subscribe, comment below if you have a question, or if you just want to say hi. I am going to include free templates for this model. Yes, free templates from my Patreon. You find the link below, and you'll be able to download the free templates from there. They'll be 8.5 by 14 sheet of paper US standard. So just keep that in mind when you need to print these things out. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Keep building.